Early one morning, Thomas and Gordon were waiting at Knapford. Gordon had just backed down to take his train when he heard a voice.
Hello, Gordon. Remember us?
Pip? Or is it Emma?
It's me! Well done. Emma is at the back today.
Why are you two here?
It was the Fat Controller who answered Thomas's question.
Philippa and Emma could be very helpful to our railway.
Helpful? How so?
As you know, Thomas, the railway has to remain competitive in order to survive. This is especially true now that there's a hovercraft running a ferry service to Sodor.
Yes, ma'am.
I've been in discussions with the other railway, and they feel that the engine changeover at Borough is taking too long. With Philippa and Emma in charge of the express, it can run straight through to London.
Thomas's face fell, and he looked over at Gordon.
But does this mean Gordon's not going to the express engine anymore?
We're only going to be looking after the London service, Thomas. We'll only be able to make one return trip by a day.
Exactly, Philippa. Gordon will be looking after some of the through trains which terminate at Borough, as well as some of the commuter runs.
Certainly, ma'am.
Those have been getting fairly busy of late. James, Alice, Bear and Henry could use some extra help.
A moment later, Gordon departed. Thomas watched him go. Even though he wouldn't be looking after the express, Thomas was glad that his friend would still be a really useful engine. A moment later, he glanced over at Pip and Emma.
Well, welcome to the railway.
Thank you.
Pip replied, as Thomas departed. But I'm afraid to say, not all the engines took the news as well as Thomas.
It's preposterous.
James spluttered that night in the sheds.
Replacing Gordon just because the other railway made a bit of a fuss about the time to change engines.
So, you don't think we should be looking after the express, James?
James paused. He hadn't meant to offend the high-speed engines.
Well, no. I mean, you and Pip are good engines. But it's just, Gordon's been looking after the express for decades.
Ah, I see where you're coming from, James. But I'm sure your controller has her reasons for bringing us in.
Well, yes, but it is a bit sudden.
It may seem a little sudden, yes.
The other engines looked over at Gordon, slightly surprised.
I thought you were taking this rather well. Does this have something to do with that trouble you were having last week?
James and Henry exchanged a look.
What? Gordon, we were only joking about retirement.
I know that, James. But there's a bit more to this than what you know. Last Monday I was having a drink here when the Fat Controller came to see me. Good morning, ma'am. What brings you here in this sort of weather?
It must be important, the express engine thought.
I've spoken to representatives of First Transpennine, and they've expressed some concern about the time it takes to change engines on the Wildnorwester.
Gordon frowned, puzzled.
That's not been an issue before, ma'am.
Yes, but things have changed. Tell me, have you heard of the new hovercraft running between Blackpool and Norramby?
Yes, Owen was telling me about it the other day. I see what you mean, ma'am.
We have to keep up with these developments if the railway is to keep going.
Yes, ma'am. What do you need me to do?
We've agreed to tighten the schedule between Knapford and London. The new schedule calls for the express to arrive a quarter-hour sooner at Crovan's Gate and a full 10 minutes earlier at Borough.
That shouldn't be a problem, ma'am.
The Fat Controller smiled.
Thank you, Gordon. I knew I could rely on you.
When will the new schedule be taking effect, ma'am?
Next week, Gordon.
A few minutes later, Gordon's fireman had finished, and the big engine departed. As he headed for the station, he couldn't help thinking about his conversation with the Fat Controller. He'd spoken confidently, but he was beginning to have his doubts. After the last adjustment of the timetable, 6 months ago, he'd been busting his boiler to keep up with it. For once, he was actually having doubts as to whether he'd be able to keep up with the new schedule.
Driver, I will need some sand, please,
Gordon said, as he backed down onto the express. His driver dropped some sand. Don't overdo it, Gordon, he said. He knew what it meant when Gordon wanted sand at the start of a run. Gordon quickly brought his train up to speed. His wheels pounded the rails, determination driving him on. It was a point of pride that his trains were always on time, if not early. This new timetable wouldn't change that, he'd just have to push himself harder. After all, he had an image to maintain.
Hello, Gordon. You're early.
How early?
Oh, I'd say a good 5 or 6 minutes sooner than usual. I've not already got time to go over to the shed before you pulled in.
5 or 6 minutes.
That's still fairly impressive. Anyway, I must be off.
Before Gordon could reply, the little diesel headed off to continue his work. To Gordon's disappointment, it was the same story at Barrow-in-Furness. He was early, yes, but not early enough. A short while later, Gordon was resting in the sheds there when Alice arrived.
You looked like you were in quite a hurry, Gordon. Were you having another time trial?
I suppose you could put it like that.
Gordon said. He explained about the new timetable and how he'd been unable to meet it. Alice paused for a few seconds, considering her words.
When I first met you on the GNR in 1920, your performance was impressive. I mean, you were able to waltz away with trains that gave me and my sisters trouble.
That's not exactly helping.
My point is that was back in 1920, Gordon. This is 2011.
Ah, I see what you mean, Alice. But we do need to remain competitive. I mean, now there's that Normanby hovercraft and all that.
I know, but there are ways to do that without you running yourself into pieces.
You mean double-heading with you, Henry, James, or Bear? I'm not sure if the Fat Controller could spare any of you.
Before Alice could reply, Gordon's driver climbed into the big engine's cab. Come on, Gordon. Time for our return run. Gordon departed, and Alice watched him go, worried for her old friend. Gordon wasn't quite sure what Alice had been getting at. Pulling trains like the Wildnorwester was what he'd been built for, after all. He would just have to do better on this return run, he thought. He was soon thundering towards Vickerstown, and making good time, when suddenly...
Driver!
Gordon could feel he was only running on one cylinder. His driver braked, and Gordon stopped, next to the ditch where he'd once spent the night. Gordon's driver examined him, while the guard went to get help. You've done it now, Gordon. Your valve gear's been damaged.
Blast!
Gordon exclaimed. He looked up, to see Owen backing down towards him.
Don't worry, Gordon,
called the diesel.
I'll take as our passenger's on, and Jeff's coming up to take you to the works.
Thank you,
Gordon replied, as Owen was coupled up. The Class 56 shunted Gordon into the sheds, which had been reopened in 1996. He then departed with the express, leaving Gordon alone. But he wasn't alone for long.
What are you doing here?
Evan demanded, as he backed down into the sheds.
Had a bit of a mishap with the express.
Gordon explained what had happened.
That was rather careless of you.
Careless? I was doing what was needed.
So damaging yourself and taking Owen away from his duties here is necessary, is it?
Gordon sighed. He didn't want to have a repeat of his discussion with Alice. Silence fell over the sheds, until Jeff arrived to take Gordon to the works. Gordon was repaired by dinner time, and he returned to the sheds that evening.
Did you have some trouble with the express, Gordon?
Just a minor mishap. Could have happened to any engine.
Really? I heard you were running so hard you damaged your valve gear. Maybe you should consider retiring, Gordon, if you can't handle the express anymore.
Perhaps you should give Patrick and Peter some help with their fast goods trains.
Don't be preposterous, Henry.
Gordon scoffed. Henry left a few moments later to take the Flying Kipper. Silence fell over the sheds, and the other engines drifted off to sleep. But for Gordon, sleep didn't come easily. In fact, he found he had a lot to think about. Early the next morning, James was sent to take the express. Gordon had been ordered to remain in the sheds. He soon found out why. The Fat Controller arrived, and she did not look happy.
Gordon, what happened yesterday? Mark Bradford at the Steamworks said you were running hard enough to rip your left valve gear off.
I wasn't trying to show off, Mom.
Okay, then what were you doing?
Trying to match that new timetable you wanted, Mom.
Oh, Gordon, I apologise. Are you saying you're not able to meet the new timetable?
It would seem so, Mom.
Even an engine like Gordon had his limits, the Fat Controller realised.
Don't worry, Gordon, I know you've done your best. I'll talk to the other railway about keeping the old schedule.
The Fat Controller headed towards her car, but stopped as Gordon spoke again.
Excuse me, Mom.
Yes, Gordon?
Miss Hatt, you said yourself that the railway needs to be competitive in order to survive. Since I arrived on this railway in 1923, trains have become heavier and longer, and timetable requirements more demanding. I've been able to keep up with these, but I'm sure you and your predecessors were aware, as I was, that a day would come when I would reach the limits of what I can do. It would seem, Mom, that day was yesterday.
The Fat Controller nodded.
Go on, Gordon.
I've been looking after the express on this railway for 87 years, Mom. That's a good run by anyone's standards, especially given that most of my brothers and cousins only got to run for about half of that. But now, I think it's in the best interests of the railway that the express is taken over by an engine whose limits are well beyond mine.
The Fat Controller wasn't sure if she was hearing correctly.
Gordon, are you saying you want to retire?
I think it's what's needed, Mom. The Wildnorwester could remain competitive with another engine, or another 2 engines.
2 engines?
Do you remember Pip and Emma, Mom? They are a high-speed train who visited us a couple of times.
Yes, I've coordinated the publicity for their last visit. Do you think they'd be suitable replacements?
Indeed, Mom.
Then I'll see if they're available.
Over the next few days, Gordon looked after the express to the best of his ability. These were his last few runs with the Wildnorwester, after all, and he ensured that they were good ones.
And that brings us to this morning, when Pip and Emma arrived.
Gordon finished.
Gordon, you...
I believe the expression is, took one for the team,
said Peter, who had arrived while Gordon was talking.
It would seem so.
So, it is the end of an era.
Henry said sadly. He understood why Gordon had stepped down, but it would be quite an adjustment.
It is the end, but the moment has been prepared for,
Gordon said, with a significant look at Pip and Emma. The high-speed engines immediately got his meaning.
Don't worry, Gordon. We'll make sure to look after your passengers, just as well as you did.
Gordon grinned. That was what he'd been hoping to hear, and he was glad his passengers would be in safe buffers.